The very notion of a single forbidden weapon, forcing the Mongol Empire to withdraw from three vast and geographically disparate regions, Europe, India, and Egypt, is a captivating historical myth. Yet, historical inquiry reveals a far more complex, nuanced, and decidedly uncinematic truth. There was no secret weapon, no ancient curse, no plague uniquely targeting Mongol armies that suddenly halted their relentless advance across continents. The reality is a tapestry woven from political succession crises, logistical limitations, fierce local resistance, environmental factors, and evolving strategic priorities within the largest contiguous land empire in history. To understand the Mongol withdrawals, we must deconstruct this pervasive myth and examine the distinct circumstances of each campaign. Let us begin with Europe. The Mongol invasion of Europe began in earnest in 1241. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, led the Golden Horde. He brought with him an army estimated between 100,000 and 150,000 men, a truly formidable force for the 13th century. This was not a raiding party, it was a conquest. Their objective was clear: subjugate the Rus' principalities, then move west to crush the fragmented kingdoms of Central and Western Europe. The Rus' lands fell first, suffering immense devastation. Cities like Kiev, Ryazan, and Vladimir were sacked and burned between 1237 and 1240. The sheer brutality and efficiency of the Mongol war machine were unlike anything Europe had witnessed. Their siege tactics, the use of composite bows, superior cavalry, and disciplined command structure overwhelmed the disunited Slavs. By 1241, the Mongols were at the gates of Central Europe. Two major battles define this phase: the Battle of Legnica and the Battle of Mohi. On April 9, 1241, near Legnica in Silesia, a combined European force, primarily Polish and German, the Knights Hospitaller, Teutonic Knights, and other contingents, led by Duke Henry II the Pious of Silesia, met the Mongol Tumans. The Mongols, under the command of Baidar and Kadan, feigned retreat, a classic Mongol tactic, drawing the European heavy cavalry into a trap. The Europeans, despite their valor, were annihilated. Duke Henry II himself was killed, his head reportedly presented to Batu Khan on a pike. Around 25,000 European soldiers perished. Just 2 days later, on April 11, 1241, a much larger Mongol force, led by Batu Khan himself and Subutai, one of Genghis Khan's greatest generals, faced King Bela IV of Hungary and his army at the Battle of Mohi, or Sajo River. The Hungarian forces, estimated between 60,000 and 80,000, were similarly outmaneuvered. The Mongols crossed the river undetected, launched a devastating night attack, and encircled the Hungarian camp. The battle was a catastrophe for Hungary, with some estimates placing their casualties as high as 70,000 men. King Bela IV fled, barely escaping with his life. The Mongol victory was total. After these decisive victories, the path to Western Europe seemed open. Cities like Zagreb and Vienna were within striking distance. Panic spread across Christendom. Emperor Frederick II called for a crusade. Pope Gregory IX mobilized forces. Yet, the Mongol advance into Western Europe halted abruptly in late 1241. Why? The definitive answer lies not in a forbidden weapon, but in internal Mongol politics: the death of Ogadai Khan. Ogadai, Genghis Khan's third son and his chosen successor, the Great Khan, Khagan of the Mongol Empire, died in Karakorum in December 1241. Mongol tradition dictated that all senior princes, Chinggisids, including Batu Khan, had to return to the Mongol heartland for the Kurultai, the Grand Council, to elect the next Great Khan. This succession crisis was paramount. The stability and unity of the vast empire hinged on a legitimate succession. Batu Khan was a formidable figure in his own right, but he lacked the undisputed authority to simply ignore the Kurultai. Furthermore, returning to Mongolia allowed him to lobby for his preferred candidate, or even his own claim, or perhaps ensure that his bitter rival, Gyuk, Ogadai's son, did not ascend to the throne unopposed. The journey from Hungary to Karakorum was thousands of miles, requiring months of travel and taking a significant portion of his army with him. While the primary reason was Ogadai's death, other factors played a secondary, though still important, role in the European withdrawal. The logistical challenges of campaigning in Central Europe were immense. The fertile Hungarian plains had been devastated, making foraging difficult. The forested and mountainous terrain of Austria and Bohemia was less suitable for Mongol cavalry tactics than the open steppes. European castles, while often falling to Mongol siege engineers, still presented obstacles and slowed their advance. Morale could also suffer from being so far from home. However, it is crucial to re-emphasize that had Ogedei lived, the Mongols would almost certainly have continued their devastating push into Central Europe. Their retreat was a strategic redeployment mandated by imperial succession, not a military defeat or a withdrawal triggered by a mythical weapon. They left Europe not because they were beaten, but because the calls of home and empire were louder than the promise of further conquest in a relatively minor theater. Next, we turn our attention to India. The Mongol relationship with the Indian subcontinent was far more protracted and complex than their whirlwind campaign in Europe. It was largely characterized by raids and border conflicts, rather than a sustained, unified imperial conquest. The Mongols, primarily the Chagatai Khanate, descendants of Chagatai Khan, Genghis's second son, and later the Ilkhanate, launched numerous incursions into India from the early 13th century into the early 14th century. The Delhi Sultanate, established in 1206, became the primary bulwark against Mongol expansion into India. Sultan Iltutmish, reigned 1211 to 1236, faced the initial threats, implementing strategic defenses. However, the most significant resistance to the Mongols in India came during the reign of Sultan Alauddin Khalji, reigned 1296 to 1316. The Mongols launched several major invasions into India during Khalji's rule. In 1297, a large Chagatai army under Dawar Khan invaded Punjab. Khalji's general, Ulu Khan, decisively defeated them at the Battle of Jaran Manjur, reportedly killing 20,000 Mongols. In 1299, another formidable Mongol army under Kutle Khwaja, estimated at 100,000 to 200,000 men, marched on Delhi itself. This was perhaps the most serious threat to the Sultanate's existence. Alauddin Khalji, against the advice of his generals, refused to retreat behind the city walls. Instead, he met the Mongols in open battle. The Battle of Kili saw heavy fighting, with both sides suffering significant casualties. While the battle itself was somewhat indecisive, the Mongols ultimately withdrew, perhaps due to internal divisions or the sheer tenacity of the Delhi Sultanate's defense. A crucial element here is geopolitics. Unlike Europe, which was largely fragile and tid, the Delhi Sultanate, despite its internal struggles, presented a more unified and organized military front. Indian armies, though different in composition and tactics from European forces, were also formidable. They utilized war elephants, a psychological and military asset that the Mongols, despite their cavalry superiority, found difficult to counter effectively in every instance. Elephants presented a moving wall and could disrupt Mongol formations, especially composite bow attacks. While the Mongols did learn to counter elephants effectively in some battles, it was never a simple matter. Furthermore, the Mongols of the Chagatai Khanate were often preoccupied with internal struggles, conflicts with the Ilkhanate, another Mongol successor state based in Persia, and maintaining control over their vast Central Asian territories. Their Indian campaigns were often opportunistic raids for plunder or attempts to extend their influence rather than a full-scale, sustained imperial conquest on the scale seen in China or Persia. The logistical challenges of campaigning deep into India, sustaining large armies over extended periods in varied terrains and climates, also presented significant difficulties. The Indian climate, particularly the monsoon season, was also a factor often overlooked. Mongol horses, adapted to the dry steppes, struggled in the humid tropical conditions. The diseases prevalent in India could also decimate an army unfamiliar with local pathogens. This was not a single apocalyptic weapon, but a gradual attrition of troops and resources. So, the Mongols did not withdraw from India in a single decisive retreat due to a weapon. Instead, their incursions became less frequent and less successful over time, due to the combination of spirited and organized resistance from the Delhi Sultanate, internal Mongol disunity, logistical difficulties, and environmental challenges. By the early 14th century, the Chagatai Khanate, weakened by internal strife and the rise of new powers, shifted its focus away from India. The Mughal Empire, founded by Babur in the 16th century, would eventually establish long-term Mongol Turkic rule in India, but that was centuries later and under vastly different circumstances. Finally, let us consider Egypt. The Mongol advance towards Egypt occurred as part of the Ilkhanate Grand Western Campaign under Hulagu Khan, another of Genghis Khan's grandsons. After the conquest of Persia and Mesopotamia, culminating in the horrific sack of Baghdad in 1258, which effectively ended the Abbasid Caliphate, Hulagu turned his attention to Syria and the Levant. Aleppo and Damascus fell in 1260, extending Mongol control to the borders of Egypt. Egypt was at this time ruled by the Mamluk Sultanate, a unique military regime. The Mamluks were predominantly Turkic slave soldiers who had risen to power, overthrowing the Ayyubid dynasty. They were a formidable fighting force, masters of cavalry warfare, much like the Mongols themselves. Their leaders, such as Sultan Qutuz and the brilliant General Baybars, were extraordinarily capable military commanders. The decisive confrontation came on September 3, 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, in Palestine. This battle is perhaps the most famous instance where the Mongol advance was definitively halted by a major military defeat. Earlier that year, Hulagu Khan had, like Batu before him, been forced to return to the Mongol heartland. This time, the reason was the death of his brother, Möngke Khan, the Great Khan. The successions of both Ogedei and Möngke fundamentally altered Mongol campaigns. Hulagu withdrew the bulk of his army from the Levant, leaving a relatively smaller force of perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 Mongols under the command of his general Kitbuka. This decision proved fatal. The Mamluks marshaled a full army, led by Sultan Qutuz and Baybars, estimated at around 20,000 to 30,000 men. The Battle of Ain Jalut was a tactical masterpiece by the Mamluks. Utilizing a feigned retreat, much like the Mongols themselves employed, Baybars drew the Mongol vanguard into an ambush. The Mamluks then enveloped the Mongols, engaging them in close-quarters combat, where their heavy cavalry and dismounted archers could negate some of the Mongol advantages. The battle raged for hours. Kitbuka, leading from the front, refused to flee and fought to the last, eventually being captured and executed. The Mongol army was decisively defeated, suffering heavy casualties. This was the first time a Mongol army had been defeated in a pitched battle by a non-Mongol force, in such a definitive manner on such a strategic scale. Ain Jalut shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility and effectively set the western boundary of the Ilkhanate. The Mamluks followed up their victory by reconquering Syria, while subsequent Mongol attempts were made to avenge Ain Jalut and reclaim Syria, notably the Battle of Wadi al-Khazandar in 1299 and the Battle of Marj al-Safar in 1303. These also ended in either Mamluk victories or, at best for the Mongols, indecisive outcomes followed by retreat. The 1303 defeat at Marj al-Safar was particularly devastating for the Mongols, marking their final significant attempt at westward expansion into the Levant. So for Egypt, the withdrawal was a direct result of a crushing military defeat at Ain Jalut, coupled with Hulagu's politically mandated recall to participate in the Kurultai for the succession of Möngke. The subsequent failures to regain Syria solidified the Mamluk victory. There was no secret weapon, but rather the exceptional military prowess and strategic brilliance of the Mamluk Sultanate. Let us briefly address the genesis of such forbidden weapon myths. Historically, great civilizations often struggled to comprehend the scale and speed of Mongol conquests. Lacking a rational explanation within their own frameworks, they sometimes resorted to supernatural or mythical causes. The Mongols were perceived as a force of nature, almost divine retribution. Early European accounts often described them as agents of the devil or Gog and Magog. Such narratives, born of trauma and a lack of understanding, laid the groundwork for later embellishments like the forbidden weapon. This historical tendency to sensationalize or mythologize catastrophic events is common across cultures and time. To summarize the actual historical conditions for the Mongol withdrawals, 1. Europe, 1241 to 1242, the death of Ogedei Khan, the Great Khan, necessitated the return of Batu Khan, and other Chinggisid princes to the Kurultai in Mongolia for the selection of a successor. This was an internal political imperative, overriding further conquest in Europe. Logistical difficulties and terrain were secondary factors. The Mongols were not militarily defeated in Europe. They withdrew for political reasons. 2. India, early 13th to early 14th centuries. Mongol incursions were primarily raids by the Chagatai Khanate, rather than sustained conquest attempts. They were met with strong, organized resistance from the Delhi Sultanate, notably under Alauddin Khalji. Internal Mongol divisions and preoccupation with Central Asian affairs, coupled with logistical challenges and the formidable Indian climate and terrain, led to the gradual cessation of major incursions. There was no single withdrawal event driven by a weapon. 3. Egypt, 1260, the Mamluk Sultanate, under Sultan Qutuz and General Baybars, achieved a decisive military victory against the Ilkhanate forces at the Battle of Ain Jalut. This landmark defeat, combined with the earlier recall of Hulagu Khan due to the death of Möngke Khan, halted the Mongol advance into the Levant and secured Egypt. Subsequent Mongol attempts to reclaim Syria also failed. The Mongol Empire was indeed the largest contiguous land empire in history, extending from East Asia to Eastern Europe. Its peak territorial extent under Möngke Khan, d. 1259, was approximately 24 million square kilometers. At its zenith, it controlled populations in the hundreds of millions. The sheer organizational genius required to maintain such an empire was staggering. However, this vastness also sowed the seeds of its eventual fragmentation. The death of a great Khan, especially one who had not clearly designated a successor, invariably led to power struggles among the descendants of Genghis Khan. These succession crises, often lasting years, fractured the empire into distinct and often warring khanates: the Golden Horde, Russia, Eastern Europe; the Chagatai Khanate, Central Asia; the Ilkhanate, Persia, Middle East; and the Yuan dynasty, China, founded by Kublai Khan. These successor states, while still immensely powerful, often prioritized their own regional interests and engaged in conflicts with each other rather than maintaining a unified front for further world conquest. This internal discord was arguably the single most important factor limiting the ultimate extent of Mongol expansion, far more so than any external forbidden weapon. Consider the Mongol military machine. It was built on speed, discipline, communication, and adaptability. Their use of the Yasa, Genghis Khan's code of law, provided a rigid framework for military and civil administration. Their horse archery was devastating. Their intelligence gathering was sophisticated. They adopted siege technology from the Chinese and Persians, developing formidable engineering corps. It is highly improbable that such a military capable of conquering empires twice its size would be stopped by a single mysterious weapon, especially without any historical record of it. The very concept of a forbidden weapon suggests a technological singularity, something utterly beyond the capabilities of the 13th century. Yet, the technology of the time, while impressive in its own right, gunpowder in China, sophisticated metallurgy, trebuchets, cannot account for such a widespread and synchronized withdrawal across multiple fronts. Had such a weapon existed, it would have fundamentally reshaped global power dynamics, and its existence would be undeniable in historical records from multiple cultures. There is no evidence in Chinese, Persian, Arabic, or European primary sources of any such device. The true forbidden weapons against the Mongols were political disunity within their own ranks, the resolute defense of established states like the Delhi Sultanate and the Mamluks, the vast logistic stretches required to maintain distant campaigns, the sheer scale of the empire making centralized control challenging, and the harsh realities of unfamiliar terrains and climates for an army dependent on the steppe doctrine of warfare. These were not singular items, but systemic factors that incrementally, or sometimes decisively, wore down the impetus of conquest. The myth of a forbidden weapon often appeals to our desire for simple, dramatic explanations for complex historical phenomena. It allows for a narrative where a seemingly invincible force is overcome by an equally powerful, almost mystical counterforce. The truth is often less dramatic but far more illuminating. history is a messy business of human decisions, geopolitical shifts, geographical constraints, and occasionally pure chance or circumstance, such as the timing of an emperor's death. The Mongol withdrawals from Europe, India, and Egypt are prime examples of this intricate interplay of forces, a testament to the resilience of human societies and the inherent limitations of even the most formidable empires. To suggest anything less is to diminish the very real struggles, brilliant strategies, and immense sacrifices made by the peoples who indeed resisted the Mongol tide. It undervalues the strategic genius of commanders like Subutai and Baybars, and the logistical brilliance of the Mongol military machine on one hand, and the Mamluk organizational structure on the other. Understanding the true reasons for these withdrawals provides a richer, more accurate picture of an extraordinary period in world history. It teaches us about the ebb and flow of power, the challenges of imperial expansion, and the enduring strength of human societies in defending their homelands, even against overwhelming odds. The Mongol Empire's legacy is immense, but equally important is the story of where and why its seemingly unstoppable march eventually faltered, not in the face of a supernatural weapon, but against the very real forces of geography, politics, and human resistance. The enduring power of this myth, however, speaks to the profound psychological impact the Mongol invasions had across the Eurasian landmass, a trauma so deep that its ripples continue to influence storytelling centuries later. This highlights the importance of historical accuracy over sensationalism in understanding our past. The enduring impact of their invasions spurred many technological and societal advancements in the regions they touched. For instance, the destruction wrought by the Mongols indirectly led to the rise of new powers, the reorganization of states, and the diffusion of technologies, from gunpowder to printing, across the continent. The constant pressure from Mongol raids on India forced the Delhi sultans to maintain a strong standing army and innovate military strategies. Similarly, the Mamluk victory at Ain Jalut solidified their control over Egypt and Syria, making Cairo a center of Islamic power for centuries. In Europe, the devastation of Eastern and Central Europe led to a rethinking of defensive strategies and ultimately contributed to the formation of stronger, more unified kingdoms in subsequent centuries. The absence of a single forbidden weapon allows us to appreciate the true resilience and strategic capabilities of the civilizations that stood against the Mongol might.